one of the most closely intertwined parts of nightlife is the fact that queer people are a part of it, make it, do it. In some cases, started their movements out of a bar.
Welcome to We Built This Brand, the podcast where we talk to the creators and collaborators behind brands and provide you with practical insights that you can use to grow your business. Today we're talking with Maggie Walsh, the head of strategy at GLOW, a creative agency focused on helping brands transform their customers into fandoms. Maggie is a self-described fan, and her work as head of strategy at GLOW spans projects with brands like Peacock and their Olympic social content to projects with Jägermeister and their recent Pride initiatives. Our chat covered everything from the projects I just mentioned to the science behind what makes fans and communities tick. And we even touched on politics just a little bit. Now, if you're looking for ways to authentically engage with your community, there's a lot of really good nuggets, a lot of really good information in this interview, and I can't express enough how much I really enjoyed having Maggie on. This is a fun conversation. I hope you get as much out of it as I did. And without further ado, here's my conversation with Maggie Walsh, head of strategy at GLOW. Maggie, welcome to We Built This Brand.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you with us today. Really excited today to learn more about you, learn more about where you work at now as the head of strategy at GLOW, and would just love to dive in by getting to know a little bit about your background and what brought you to GLOW. So I'll let you take it away.
Awesome. Thank you. So I joined GLOW about a year and a half ago. And I think for me, it was definitely an evolution of all the things that I've loved over my career, now packaged in one awesome place. So just a little bit about GLOW. And then I think it will make sense if you hear a little bit about me, which is, GLOW's a creative shop, independent, based out of New York, but we have people all over. And we work mostly in a lot of social and a lot of entertainment spaces, but our real focus is fandom and really helping brands either uncover or unleash their fandoms in new ways. For me, why that was so perfect, I started my career in music. I've always been kind of a fangirl at heart. I've always been the person that's not necessarily the creative expressionist where I'm going to make the album or I'm going to make the music, but I really love helping people bring that to, the masses or fans in a new way. So I started in music, worked in music for a while, in digital and social, and then kind of started to want to learn a little bit more about the craft of marketing and just sort of how to be more effective. And so I shifted agency side. From there, I went to 360i. 360i was an amazing agency that really taught me not only how to sort of channel social media expertise, but really gave me a background in account planning, traditional strategy, really awesome stuff. And I got a chance, I worked there for a really long time. I got a chance to work on entertainment brands that wanted to be really big on social. One of the first brands that I worked on there and ended up working close to a decade on was Oreo. Oreo was really, literally, I think the first thing that I did on that project was working on the Super Bowl Dunk in the Dark, but then got to work with them and an amazing team throughout my career. And then from there, I went to A&E Network. I worked in television for a bit. I wanted to kind of go back into entertainment. I worked on the Critics' Choice Awards with them. And then from there, I went to Anomaly, where again, I was working more on brands, really, again, things that were focused on sort of bringing brands to culture, and then eventually made my way to GLOW. And like I said, I give that little background because I always like to tell people, is if you look at it, you can tell that maybe I can't decide what I want to be. Do I want to work in entertainment? Do I want to work in social? Do I want to work in agencies? And finally, I kind of found a place that was like, why not everything? And it's been perfect.
Yeah. And to that point, so tell us a little bit more about what GLOW does, why all that amalgamation of experience really helps you in your current role.
Sure. So like I said, we're really focused on this idea of fandom, but what that really translates to is clients usually come to us when they want to figure out social, when they want to build a fan community, or they want to become relevant in culture. I would say a good portion of the brands that we work on are in the film entertainment space. So streamers, I just came off working with Peacock, working with them on the Olympics and trying to figure out how to take what you were seeing on the platform and on television and bring it to a social audience. And we also work on, like I said, like a lot of plenty of TV shows. I mean, I'm working on, I don't know how many TV shows right now, but helping them figure out how we're going to launch for a new season or for premiere. That I would say is a huge core of what we do. But then we also work on brands and we work on other sort of projects. They're also looking for similar things. So I also work on, for example, Jägermeister. We're the social AOR for Jägermeister globally. And so they might not be an entertainment brand, but I've always been very impressed with them as a brand because they really understand and have sort of oriented their brand to be very social first, very culture first. Social is never an afterthought to what they do. It's at the core of how they express their brand. So that's a few examples of some of the stuff that we do. We work on NBA, we've worked with Spotify, any sort of brand or client that is interested in sort of tapping into culture, whether that's a subculture or mass culture, is something that we really specialize in.
That's really neat. And when it comes to building fandoms, I mean, I can see how like going from like a music background and working in the music industry really lends itself to now, because you got to get that word of mouth for smaller bands. You got to drive interest in what they're doing.
And what I love that you said that, because I love that the parallels to me between like social media marketing and, let's say, music marketing is you're talking to an audience with like a very low tolerance for BS, right? And so you have to, you know what I mean? Like, like how many, I'm not going to name names because I also don't want to get canceled, but there's celebrities like right now on TikTok or internet being canceled for like lack of authenticity, right? Because people want to understand what they're getting. And so I feel like that, starting in the music industry really kind of, I don't know, created that drive in me to always do stuff that passes that BS test a little bit.
I definitely grew up in the era of like indie rock and things like that. And so for me, like seeing bands go mainstream and watching their rise become something more popular, like you just lose interest in bands sometimes because they try too hard or they go the wrong direction.
I feel like we're having a kind of a similar, like almost a turnaround, right? Like to your point, like the indie rock era was like, don't sell out, don't look a certain way, like don't even be like too clean in terms of how you dress because you're going to look at your haircuts. And like now we live in an era where like every single person has grown up kind of marketing themselves for better or for worse, right, through social media. I'm starting to see like a similar backlash, right, where I feel like the similar conversations of like Nepo babies or industry plants, like are those new conversations for now, or are they the same conversations that we've always had in a new era? I don't know. But
yeah, I mean, Chapel Rowan is a good example of like that whole growth, indie growth. People, and now she's getting famous. So how long before people are like, oh no, she's mainstream now?
Yeah, exactly. And then it's the next thing, and then
exactly. Well, that's really neat. So you're trying to build fan bases. It sounds like a lot of this is really either building or activating, growing, finding. All of that is a big part of the focus. How do you go about even identifying what a fan base looks like and profiling that and then identifying it, growing it, measuring it? I'm asking a lot all in one, so feel free to break that up.
Thank you for asking. Those are great questions. I mean, obviously, it depends. I'll give you the answer of it depends on who's asking and what their challenge is, right? But I think I'll say a lot of times I'll go to brands. We'll say, we're really big on fandom. We want to build fan bases. And there are certain brands that might go, well, that's not for me. I'm certain boring product X or something that won't ever have fans. I'm not Chapel Roan or whoever. Those are the ones I love to challenge a little bit more, right? Because the way that we like to look at things is sort of, I like to look at it as kind of the intersection of brand and culture. So like starting with the question I always said is there is something fan worthy in your brand's DNA. You have something that people want to be fan. Let's start, like, ignore everything else. Let's like look deep. And so we do, and it can come to life in a lot of different ways, but we go deep with the brands and say, hey, like, we look into their brand purpose. We look at what people are saying in social. Let's look at your archives. I mentioned Jägermeister. One of my favorite things that we did when we got that account, we all flew to Germany. We went into their archives. We sat with them. Like, and honestly, again, that's why I kind of complimented them. Like, they are set up to do that. They think that way, really trying to understand, what is the thing that we want. We don't want to change your brand to fit culture, right? I think that's how you lose with the efficacy or, the magic of your brand. I think, especially in like a lot of social media marketing environments, I think I don't want to say there's pressure, but there's sometimes expectation that like you have to keep reinventing your brand to a degree in order to appeal to the current generation or the current trends and things like that. And to me, it's more about reinterpreting, right? Which is like your brand is your brand, and understand, okay, what are the elements that are right that you can either bring or contribute to today's culture. So that's half of it, the what's in your DNA piece. And then there's the other part, which is the culture part, which is like, what is fueling fandom right now in culture and how can you serve that, right? So we talk a lot about fan service, right? So like fans want something, they need something, or they, and it kind of depends on what we're talking about. You take that first part of the equation and say, okay, how can we use this to serve that? So when I talk about it in that term, I guess it sounds like it's just a simple equation, fandom, right? But I think starting from there, because I think sometimes it feels easy to kind of just start with, what do people really like right now? And let's attach ourselves to that. And that actually will work really well, right? That's not a bad strategy, but you have to keep doing it. And again, you start reinventing your brand to kind of fit everything. So that's why we like to start there. So I think that was a little bit about your first part of your question, like how do we think about it? I think you started to say, how do we measure it and take that ROI? Was that the second part of the question?
Yeah.
Remember?
Yeah.
Okay. Obviously, again, it depends on the brand in question, but I would say over, let's say, the past decade, and don't quote me, you can't quote me on that because we're being recorded, but let's say over the past decade, I would say that there has been, thanks to digital and social, right? There's been a large conversation that people haven't been investing in brand, right? Because digital and social advertising methods have given you a lot of short-term results, right? In terms of who you don't have to spend as much. You can see a number that says the word ROI, and all of those things. But I think now what we're starting to see, because we've had like a long time of that, we're starting to see like what happens to brands over time. We've had a variety of financial crises or pandemics or things that might impact that. I think the bigger conversation now is, how do you invest in long-term brand value while at the same time obviously seeing short-term results? Usually the way that we are orienting with how to measure fandom and how to measure efficacy is looking at what are the short-term metrics that can indicate it, but tying those back to brand, business, and real objectives. And I think, the way that we often talk about it, I think, and I've seen this with a lot of brands, which is the brands that are more culturally relevant, the brands that have had more of those things, like it's been measured, or more brand fame, even, let's say, sustained over time, they are more likely to weather the challenges or the changes that have been facing, right? I think, not 100% sure of the study, but they looked at it from like the 2008 financial crisis, and they looked at it with the pandemic. They looked at what brands were spending and what brands, and like, you look at it, the ones that invested in brand and being relevant, not the ones that cut their spending, not the ones that just did short-term stuff, they ended up being more profitable, more successful over time. So anyways, it's a long-winded way of saying is, of course, it's complicated, but usually it's a format of, okay, let's look at what short form or short-term metrics can indicate and be tied to bigger brand goals, relevance, and things like that. So I'm happy to get more specific if that feels too broad or generic.
I think that's a good starting point for that concept, because where you can take it from there is, of course, I think the next question that I have out of that is, well, you've got these brands that chase trends, and then you've got brands that are relevant, and people can sniff it out, like we've been saying. But how do you determine what is important in terms of relevance versus what is just a trend?
It's great. I would say you can pretend, you can sort of know, you can say, with hindsight, but I actually think the best way to do is to be a little bit experimental, but experiment with purpose. The brand that spends years perfecting their brand book or whatever version of relevance more than they spend time trying to be relevant in culture will probably always be behind the one that maybe chased some trends and had some, in my opinion, chased some trends, made some mistakes, probably was like, wait, you switched strategies, but learned and kind of evolved from them. So I am sort of speaking out of two sides of my mouth. But so I said, on one hand, I would say, start with your brand, say all of the things that you want to kind of do and not just chase trends, but don't be afraid to make small bets to turn into bigger bets. So like a lot of times that is the way that I'm either advising clients or we try and structure things where you'll kind of say, okay, and that's where social comes in, right? Social is essentially like the greatest expression of a brand that you can get instant feedback on every day. And I think like I'll use Oreo as an example, right? I worked and, I was lucky enough to work with them for a really long time. But one of the first things that they did kind of as an experiment as part of the Daily Twist, which was a campaign that they were doing around their 100th birthday, was they put for Pride Month, they did a rainbow Oreo, and that posted viral, or went viral. Not even using the correct terms. Those went viral, did well, it went viral. And that particular nugget, at least in my mind, is what gave them, okay, what are we going to do a little bit more? How do we start investing in this community? And it eventually, over time, turned into a long-term partnership and allyship with that community that was expressed itself in many ways. So by the time that they came out few years ago and said, we're going to do a product for LGBTQ Pride Month, right? It wasn't coming out of left field. And I think it's easy to want to start with that and be like, let's do this big thing now that we know it's the right thing. And a lot of the stuff in one of your social posts doesn't take off, then okay, you learned. And maybe it did. So I would say like that would be the way that I tend to advise, which is yes, mine for what's fan worthy in your DNA, be smart about it, but then make small bets so that you can learn and invest and turn into those bigger cultural moments, the things that are taking off.
Yeah, that makes sense. You saying that brings actually an Oreo example to mind. And I don't know if you happen to have been there during the time when this happened, but the eclipse that happened not the most recent eclipse, but the like 2014, 15, 16, somewhere in there. When the eclipse happened, they were trying to make Oreo the official cookie of the eclipse.
Yeah. Somewhat remember this?
Yes. And they were trying to position it as that. And then out of nowhere, Moon Pie, who is a great Southern brand, came out and basically burned them on social media. And that was a spark for Moon Pie's social media advertising.
Yeah. It's so funny because I absolutely love Moon Pie, both as a product and as a social media account. And when you said, I was like, I kind of forgot that's how that happened, and I absolutely love it. I must not have been working on it. I don't remember, or I just don't remember. But
I remember it very distinctly.
Well, I love it because it's like not an underdog story, but like brands burning each other or even having a negative opinion on social was new, I feel like at that time, like
it was risky.
Yeah, every brand, every brand tone of voice to a degree. It says we want to be nice and relatable and approachable, and we never mock or whatever. And I think having a brand be willing to do that was, again, authentic. That's how people talk. I can roast you right now without being a terrible person or dislike you. Actually, might like me more for it. I won't try, but I could.
Yeah, please. But no, the Moon Pie story stuck out to me because where I'm from, or where we live now, Knoxville, Tennessee, we have Tom Briss, who runs the account for Moon Pie. So it was big news here locally when that happened in the marketing community. And I just remember it being such a big deal that it happened. And yeah, it felt like a huge shift in their tone after that too.
Like I said, am aware of their stuff, and I didn't know that was the impetus, which is even more exciting to me. I have a strategist here who is awesome, who went to school at Knoxville, was working at Tom Briss. I'm going to check in with her, and she'll probably school me and tell me I know all about it.
Yeah, but that's a really neat example of like where that pays off, like that edginess that they were going for, which I know it was happening before the eclipse and everything, but when Oreo made that grand statement, Moon Pie had this great chance to just like steal their thunder with that joke, and it did great. It was one that helped them, I think, really elevate their brand and move on. So that's the one example that comes to mind for me.
So what I love about that example is like, one of the things I always like to say is like, your brand is what your fans say you are. And that's such a perfect example, which is your fans didn't say you were sponsoring the eclipse. And so we could dig at it a little bit, and it worked. You know what I mean? I think that's really cool.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So there's another side to it, which is, of course, people finding out you're fake, that inauthenticity. You mentioned working with Jägermeister during Pride, and as we've seen in recent years, alcohol brands have not had the best relationship with Pride events. So like, how do you navigate those water, a traditional German brand and something as potentially challenging as, celebrating Pride Month can be?
Yeah, I mean, I think all the credit is to the brand itself, right? I think they are coming from it from a very authentic place in the sense that they have been investing in the LGBTQ community for a very long time, probably at least in my mind, before it was cool to do so. So that in terms of authenticity, right? But I think for them in particular, it was kind of twofold. I think number one, they're they're big on investing in nightlife and the future of nightlife, right? Which is, not only are they a product that's drunk during them, but like if we all want to continue doing that, nightlife has to exist. And I think there are different things in the world that can be a threat to nightlife, right? I think, and one of them is that one of the most closely intertwined parts of nightlife is the fact that queer people are a part of it, make it, do it, in some cases started their movements out of a bar. And I think starting from a place of that deep understanding has also pushed them to really invest in keeping that alive. Just, even on the back end, they invest in, again, all of this is, I think, predating our relationship with them. This is just lucky enough, I feel like, to be involved on some of the work that they're doing now. But they invested in a project called the Lesbian Bar Project, which was essentially about the fact that lesbian bars were closing nationwide and closing globally, and helping not only spotlight them, but help sort of what's now kind of turning into a bit of a resurgence and renaissance of the lesbian bar. And then similarly during COVID and when nightlife closed down, realizing that who were really affected were bartenders, people that were owning those spaces. So they created the Save the Night Fund, which was really around helping invigorate nightlife. So when we were working on it for this most recent Pride Month, that was the foundation that we started from. It was less about how do we promote ourselves and like just throw a party and like tap into stuff, and really about partly honoring queer people's contribution to nightlife, especially at a time right now when those things are kind of being called into question, especially in our country. And then secondarily, we also had this insight that supposedly Pride Month is for LGBTQ people, but if you work at a gay bar in June, you are working all month, right? You're having fun, but you have just worked probably like the craziest month of all time. So what we did was we did a give back, essentially, which was essentially July 1st, when a lot of brands are like, let's take off the rainbows and go away. We're like, this is actually where we're really mostly starting. And we essentially gave away and paid off bar tabs for queer nightlife staff and folks around the globe so that they can take their staff out and sort of get that time off when they had essentially worked all of June. Again, I'm using those as examples because I think it is marketing, but essentially it's all coming from a place of respect. And again, like consistency. A lot of brands want to start with the party or the celebration versus the work and the investment to kind of get there.
Yeah, it's kind of like one of the things I always noticed about the Pride Month in recent, probably the last decade or two, when it's really become prominent for corporations to get involved, is their logo turns rainbow for a month and then they're gone. And what I love out of what you just said is that you started on July 1st. And to me, the idea of being intentional with something beyond just June is what really matters. And I think that has a lot of value in showing that you're doing something that's leaving a legacy, not just, hey, we're just going to be here. That shows you're actually serving during that month and you're not just adopting a color scheme for a month.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a really elegant way of putting it, which is, are you benefiting more from your association with the movement, or is the movement at all benefiting from your association with it? And, especially in like social movements like that, I think it's always, you want to lean on the other end, the other side of it. So I love how you put it.
Yeah. Yeah. If you're going to do something like that, you got to commit. I mean, Bud Light showed us that one.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the worst way possible. But yeah, that's really neat. So what other work happens at GLOW? Like what else is part of your portfolio, or what other projects have you been really proud to be a part of? I know you mentioned before we got started with the interview that you've done work with Peacock and the Olympics. That just happened. Would love to hear about that.
Yeah, we just wrapped a project with Peacock on the Olympics, which was really fun. I mean, honestly, just like if I wasn't a super fan of the Olympics before I started that, I think I came out of it a super fan of the Olympics. I don't know. I feel like just even as a consumer and a marketer, I had so much fun working on it. But yeah, so Peacock obviously is the streaming platform under NBC, and so both of those organizations are responsible for bringing the Olympics to American consumers. So yeah, Peacock partnered with us to essentially do what I would call the culture side of the Olympics, which is how do we take the coverage that you're seeing, on platform and on television and bring it to a social audience? And in particular, how do we bring people that maybe aren't huge sports fans into the conversation who could become a fan, right? And I think we were talking about how rugby became such a huge part of the conversation this Olympics. And in particular, I would say the star player of that team, Ilona Maher, who is basically, one of the first social athletes from the Olympics, right? She came really onto the scene the last Olympics. For example, we saw like a lot of conversation around, people getting excited about rugby. People would never watch rugby. People didn't know that we had a national rugby team. Getting excited, taking that and bringing it to social. So like one of the things that we notice that a lot of fans do is they do fan cams, or what they call like fan edits, where it's like whoever is their favorite person in a space, sort of something that's, or when I say space, I mean like a musician, an actor or something like that. They'll do like a little edit to kind of celebrate them. We started just doing that during the Olympics when certain things would happen. We're like, let's do a fan edit. And Ilona, reposted a ton of those things. It was just a way to speak in fans' language as they were watching it.
Yeah. And when you say fan edit, you mean you're actually pulling like fan created content. So it's original content.
We would mostly, I would say, pull from the actual broadcast itself.
Yeah, I gotcha.
Mix that with some of our own stuff in the style of, I think when I say sort of fan edit or fan cam, I mean as if we are a fan, you know what I mean? And like we were hyping her up more so than who we're pulling from or things like that.
Yeah, I know there's content licensing issues. I'm a big F1 fan, and I'm watching everything happen in that world right now too, with they're cracking down on creators. That's a whole other side note that's not part of this conversation. But yeah, I know that's a challenge in that field.
Yeah, it's definitely, Congress is dealing with it on the TikTok side. Not just out of copyright, but like who owns what and where's the data? And, especially when you're working with a TV streamer, who owns what, where can you put it? All part of the conversation now.
Yeah, but that's neat. Getting people excited about rugby. I'm a fan of rugby. I played rugby for a little while myself. Very, very little while, but it was still a lot of fun when I did it. It's cool to see stuff like that become more prominent. Well, what was the other sport that got really big this year? I'm trying to remember.
Well, there was definitely a sport that got a lot of conversation. Now, is it popular? You know which one I'm talking about.
Boxing.
Boxing. Yeah. I was going to say breakdancing, but
breakdancing. Yes, breakdancing. There we go. Much better topic.
Yeah. That was, again, probably for not always the best reasons, right? But like more people were talking about boxing and breaking around what was happening more so than I think ever talked about either of those sports leading into the Olympics. And so good or bad, there I think is something really powerful to see, right? Which is like a sport like the Olympics being able to, not a sport, an event like the Olympics being able to inspire that conversation. And I think, at least for this year, it felt like everyone was sort of watching and participating around one thing, which I think happened a bit.
Right. And I was about to say, as you're saying that, I'm realizing like if you look at presidential elections, the way we engage with elections and the way we engage with politics now is way different. It feels like one giant conversation, for better or worse, or at least two different conversations happening, for better or worse. But when it comes to the Olympics, this year felt like the first time I'd seen something of that level happen in a while, at least when it comes to like the conversations that were happening all over the globe and the way people were tuning in. We've had the Olympics for years and years and years, but it feels like for the first time in a long time, like people were actually dialed into it and interested in a way I hadn't seen in a long time.
It feels like to me, and again, this is hypothesis and also bias from being involved, I guess, but it feels like, I don't know if you remember, but the last Olympics were not in 2020, they were in 2021. They hosted the 2020 Olympics in 2021. So it's a little bit shorter time. It was also, you would think that would be the time we're all inside, we're all trying to, like, let's all kind of do it. But I think at least our country was feeling very divided. There was a lot happening, right? Whereas I think this time around, we had two things change, right? We had a different cultural environment, yes. We also had the first time, at least in my opinion, Gen Z athletes with their phones in the Olympic Village. And the rules were a little bit looser this year versus previous years. They've at times been somewhat restricted on how much content or things they could share and things like that. Not only like, we're talking about this rugby player, but her times like 1,000, right? They're in there filming content and doing stuff and bringing in all these people that are just following them as influencers into this event. And then the other side of it, I think, again, kudos to, I would say, like a Peacock, which is everything was happening live. So even though the games were happening in Paris, which is a time difference from here, you could watch it live as it was happening and you could watch it in prime time. So I think it created this groundswell where we could watch it all at the same time. We could talk about it. And then you also had the most social generation in the world filming it from their own iPhones.
That is a good point. I think that's probably why it felt more prominent, was because there was more social content from individuals that were there participating, and it brought a new level of awareness to it that I hadn't really seen. Now, I grew up a swimmer. I made state in high school, so I was swimming pretty competitively at that point. 50 free, 100 free, and backstroke were my three big swimming events, and they would always throw me in the 500, which I hated.
I was the one that had to I could never do that. I just did the little counting for my friend. Yeah.
Oh, nice. So did you swim?
I did, but I wasn't a good swimmer.
Okay.
Not competitively. So you watched the swimming. Did you watch the diving as well?
I did not watch the diving as much, but since I swam all the way through high school, I always try to pay attention to at least some swimming, see some of the events. That French swimmer this year, man, he was wow. The guy who did the 400 IM that he did, finishing by that far ahead is just impressive in any sport. But when it's the top of everybody, it just shows you how incredible someone is. Yeah, it's really cool. Yeah, the Olympics were just really fun this year. So I definitely agree. Were you actually over there during that time, or were you just working remote?
We worked out of, NBC Sports has a studio in Stamford, Connecticut. So not Paris, but Stamford, Connecticut, where they were doing some of the commentary and stuff. So we worked out there.
That's really neat. Complete non sequitur. One of my wife's best friends is a videographer, and he was over there with NBC doing some of the filming over, I think, wrestling or something like that.
Background content or broadcast?
Broadcast. He was helping with broadcasts. My wife's alma mater, Asbury University, has a relationship with NBC, and they always send a group of students over. So he's been going since he was in college, and he's been involved with the Olympics since college.
Yeah, that's the kind of person I would love to pick their brain, where I'm like, tell me, how does it, I have a perception difference of what I think host countries bring to each of them, but I'm watching the broadcast. I want to know what's it really like? How does it feel? One
of these days I'll get over there, or we'll find one. I mean, it's coming to LA next. It shouldn't be as difficult.
Of course, LA traffic is already a mess, so we'll see.
Right. Yeah. You go from a 6-hour time difference one way to a 3-hour, then the other way the next. So in terms of the industry right now, just as we're wrapping up, what is top of mind for you? What are you thinking of as you look at brands, as you look at what's coming next? I mean, there's things like the TikTok ban on the horizon and some of these things. What are you thinking of right now for the future of fandoms?
Oh, geez. I mean, probably 100 things. I feel like a thing that is a big conversation or a theme of conversations that I hear a lot of. But when you talk about things like TikTok ban, I also think about AI or things that are supposedly threats to our industry. And they're going to change our industry. They're changing our industry now. If TikTok gets banned, who knows? Lots of things will change. But I don't want to say I don't worry about those, because again, I feel like people are adaptable, brands are adaptable. The brands that are able to adapt to change are the ones that will have longevity. And I believe in our ability to help them with that. And then another thing that's actually really big on my mind this week is ethical fandom, which I know sounds like a buzzword that I just invented, but we were talking about Chapel Roan. I saw a lot of fans, these people that are blowing up really quickly. And there's a lot of conversation right now, both around positive things of Chapel Roan came out on TikTok this week saying Fame was essentially fan culture is really bad and like there are stalkers and you can't own her and all of this stuff. And like it was really, really emotional and empathetic. At the same time, at the Olympics, other things, I'm seeing people sort of, for lack of a better term, cancel, let's say, a Blake Lively right now for how she's essentially appearing in interviews and potentially with somebody else. Now, again, I'm not taking a position on either of these right this second, but it brings up this question because we're an agency that is very much around how do we build fandom. I'm also kind of interested as like, what does more ethical or what standard or what responsibility do we have as an agency involved in creating this and creating a fan culture that is mutually beneficial to fans, but also the people involved? Because like, even like, again, I'll use Chapel because we're using her as an example, but like she started out as a fan, you know what I mean? She started out with a TikTok. She was doing all of these things that we're talking about. So like, I don't think it's like fan versus artist or this or that. I think we're all kind of part of this fan culture. And now we're kind of, again, it's one of those things that has been happening in the social media age now for so long that we have like a lot of, we're seeing kind of the repercussions over time because we've had enough time pass. And so again, I don't have an answer to that question, but it is something that's been weighing on me a lot, which is like, it's the same thing that you were talking about with brands getting involved in like pride or LGBTQ stuff, right? I think when we were in the frontier of that and it was new, it was different than what you're doing it right now. You know what I mean? And I think similarly, it's the question that I'm starting to have in what we do as well. And I believe in it. I'm a fangirl. I think everyone should be obsessed with something, but it's a question that I wonder about.
I think that's that's a great thing to consider because my day job is Humble Pod. We're a podcast production company. We deal with creators and originators of content, and we don't deal with too many people that are like really high profile, but we do have a few that we've dealt with. Yeah. And in what I've noticed, like in interacting with them, or like I went with one client recently, I'm going to try and stay vague so people can't figure it out. They'll probably figure it out if they know me and the client, but it's nothing private. I just don't want to talk about it too much. But like going to events where they're known, going to places where that person, even in a small sphere of influence compared to someone like Chapel Rowan, like you get people that just act like they know you. It's the parasocial relationship is the term I've heard. It sounds so terrible to say, but like, it's just like they think they know you because they listen to you on a podcast or they hear your voice and they get to know you. They get familiar with that voice. They get familiar with that conversation. And eventually they get to a point where I think they just feel like, oh, I can talk to that person. I can walk up to them. They're my friend. I identify with them in so many ways. They would, if they just knew me better, we'd be cool. And it's just that logic that sometimes puts these people in a position of like, I can't handle that. Like, I need space from this because these people just assume that they have this access to me because they listen to my podcast, they contribute to this, they contribute to that. And it's difficult. It's a difficult water to navigate.
Yeah. And I don't know the answer to it because I think there's good and bad, right? There's the benefit, like people love to create. They love to have most people love to have fans, right? The idea of fandom is generally positive, and not every individual fan is bad or the extreme version of it. There has been a culture shift, as fandom has expanded and become less of a, being a super fan was like for really niche things or sports teams. And now it's sort of like part of our culture because of social media. And I don't think we've quite figured out how we want to be as a culture. Like we're still figuring it out. We're like, that's weird. We're doing that. Okay, let's go the other way.
I think that's a good way to put it too, as a culture, that is, because it is very much an American thing, I think, to feel entitled to be able to talk to celebrities. I've been a big fan of the show Top Gear for a long time. And so guys like Jeremy Clarkson and James May and Richard Hammond, like when they're in the UK, my understanding from fans abroad and stuff is the rule of thumb in the UK is you just let them be. You don't bother them. You don't come up and interrupt. It's a politeness thing.
Yeah. Is that British culture or is it not it's like be polite?
I think it's British culture because there are definitely other cultures where they're not that way. I've definitely, there was a girl, this is way back in college, dated a girl and she had red hair and somebody thought some group of tourists thought she was Scarlett Johansson. I think there was an Asian group and they were just like, oh, this person, you're this person. And they flocked to her and took her picture and acted like she was a celebrity, just harassed her until they had gotten their fair share and moved on. So it's definitely culture to culture. It varies, I think. But yeah, it definitely is something that, like, I don't know. It'd be an interesting thing to evaluate as you evaluate how you deal with celebrities in different locales and different places.
That's an interesting question. What does celebrity mean globally? Probably means, and what kind of celebrity is also valued is both cultural in place, but also cultural, I think, in time, evidenced by who's getting canceled and who is rising up right now. But
yeah, it definitely is something that I would love to see more research on and need to keep a pin in myself. So I'm right there with you. Well, that's cool. Well, as we wrap up, I always like to ask at the end of the interview, you've mentioned being a fangirl multiple times. What brand are you most a fan of right now?
I mean this apolitically, but something that I've just been obsessed with because of my inner fangirl is Kamala HQ. It's just, I've just been like, holy cow, I love it. It's like, wish I could have done that. I love being healthy jealous, but yeah, they've been an incredible sort of study on being authentic and relevant as a social media strategy.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I've been keeping up with politics and things, and it's been a really wild ride this past few months with everything going on, but to see that social change around her, yeah, she's relatable. It'll be interesting to see how people relate to her.
Yeah, I'm curious. It's hard for me I can't evaluate the efficacy of it yet, but in terms of like a brand and brand social, it's been something I've been really impressed with. And I think it's funny, if you had asked me in 2016, I might have, again, not endorsing anything, but I was impressed with the social media culture around Trump. It doesn't mean I agreed with it, but in terms of like Reddit and meme culture and what they were able to do, I thought was also something to learn from, even if the lesson is different.
A very different lesson, but something that I've definitely been fascinated with as well over the years. Follow politics quite a bit, but yeah, that whole like deep dive that went from just being a Trump fandom to almost being a cult around personality and everything.
I mean, it's probably the other side of the coin of what we just talked about. Where does deep fandom turn into something more sinister, essentially? And is it whose responsibility is it to keep it from turning that way? Is it something that we teach on ourselves, or we all go move to Britain, maybe?
Yeah, you're touching on something that, I mean, should be a podcast in and of itself, but is also one of the things, again, like just when I think about podcast content we create, it's that same thing of like, what are we influencing by putting this voice out here and by allowing them to say what they're saying?
I admire folks in your position who have to make that kind of decision because, we only see the results of it. We just see what we see. We don't see the 9 or 10 decisions on what that was. So, yeah. Exactly.
Well, where can people get in touch with you? Where can they find out more about GLOW?
Well, you can definitely go to our website, weareglow.com. And then people can easily find me on LinkedIn, Maggie Walsh. And then social media handle is the same on every platform. It's @MonsterMags, MAGGS. So.
Love it. Awesome. Well, Maggie, thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you. This has been fantastic. I really appreciate this and have enjoyed talking to you.
Absolutely. I've enjoyed it as well. Thanks for checking out this episode of We Built This Brand. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe on your player of choice. And you can also keep up with the podcast at webuiltthisbrand.com. If you like this episode, please give the podcast a 5-star review and be sure to tell all your friends so we can continue to build this brand.